Recently, I watched Tonya, the truly excellent film about the rise and fall of former figure skating star Tonya Harding, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was well acted and directed, and had some really great editing and told a character-based story which was interesting and engaging. But I'm not here to do a review for Tonya. Actually, I just want to focus on one aspect, one thing which Tonya does better and more accurately than any other movie, and that's its depiction of abusive relationships. Plenty of movies and TV shows have featured domestic violence, and they mostly get the primary effects of domestic violence right. But they also mostly give us one-dimensional portrayals. The abuser is often shown as a sadistic bully who revels in being an awful person and gets off on their treatment of the victim. The victim is often shown as a weak and fearful person who knows that they're in an abusive relationship and that they should leave it, but they can't because they're too afraid. But I don't believe that this is wholly accurate. The real dynamic of abusive relationships is far more complex and confusing. And this is where Tonya excels, where so many fall short. I think I should issue a disclaimer at this point. Whether or not the events in Tonya Harding's life are accurately reflected in this movie is irrelevant. I'm only interested in how the movie portrays abusive relationships and the people involved. I think an interesting aspect of this horrible moment that Nancy Kerrigan has her kneecap broken is that it can be traced all the way back to events when Tonya was just a young girl. This will probably work better if we start at the end. So this guy breaks Nancy Kerrigan's knee because he was paid by this guy, who believes that he's doing something nice and thoughtful for Tonya, who was only with him because of this lady, her mother. One thing that other movies featuring domestic abuse pretty much never discuss or examine is the long-term effects of that abuse. The first abusive relationship in Tonya is the one between Tonya and her mother. Her mother is physically, verbally and emotionally abusive throughout her entire upbringing. Her father seemed to be a good stabilizing effect, but he left her at a young age, leaving her only role model and source of support to be her mother. This led to a belief that this kind of relationship was not just normal, but expected for girls like Tonya. But exactly how does that happen? Why would a child hold up such an abusive woman as a role model when she's so horrible? This is where the exploration of abusive psychology in Tonya begins to explain things. Tonya's mother doesn't believe herself to be a villain or a bad person. She genuinely sees herself as a positive influence on her daughter who pushes her towards greatness. And the instances of abuse are simply tools for positive change from her perspective. The reason she is able to do this is because she is also the primary source of encouragement for Tonya when on the ice. This means that as a small child, Tonya saw her mother as both a supporter and an abuser, all mixed into one person. Meaning when her mother told her that the abuse was for her own good, or she deserved it, Tonya believed it. This is something which abusive people are able to do very well. They mix in examples of positives with their abuse, which makes it harder to see the person as an aggressor. We always like to believe the best in people that are close to us, so that's what we do. Ignore the abuse and pay attention to the positives. This is repeated later when her husband Jeff, who also physically abuses her, sees himself as a very nice guy and incorrectly rationalizes his abuse in the context of both passion and support for Tonya. When combined with the similar upbringing that her mother gave her, this means that Jeff is able to occupy the same space and function in Tonya's life as her mother.
I admit it. A part of me still thought that the sun rose and set with her.
Jeff genuinely sees himself as a person who cares for Tonya, even years later. These aren't characters which abuse Tonya because they're evil, sadistic bullies. They don't even believe that they're abusing her. These are characters who consider themselves as helpful, loyal supporters. It's no wonder that she wandered from one abusive situation to another. It's very hard for her to even see what abuse is. Which is another thing that this movie gets right. Abused people are often completely unaware that they're being abused and accept the excuses and rationalizations given to them by their abusers, only really seeing the truth when they finally break free. Other movies paint victims as people who want to break free but are too scared to, when in reality,
I don't think I can make it to the Olympics without you.
They often don't want to break free because they don't see the relationship as abusive at all. Abusers are also very good at painting themselves as the victim and believing it. Her mother believes she's a victim as she pushed Tonya to become a great skater at financial cost to herself, which she feels Tonya never repaid in any way. And Jeff actually convinces himself that all of his actions are a result of Tonya being aggressive and bullying towards him. Assuming the role of the victim prevents Tonya from doing so, and subconsciously encourages her to assume the role of perpetrator, which helps to explain her conflicted feelings towards these people. This brings me to Tonya herself. After the disappearance of her father, she then had no positive role models, nobody to protect her, and no form of escape, apart from the ice. This one aspect of her life became the single most important aspect, as it was the one thing she could enjoy with impunity. So even though her mother would abuse Tonya, she was also the source of skating. This reinforced the idea in Tonya's mind that her mother was trying to help, even when hurting her, because how could someone who truly didn't care put so much effort into giving her the one thing she wanted the most? Imagine being a child and not being able to distinguish whether your parent is abusive or not, because they're also the source of the things that make you happy. In reality, of course, this simply became another tool to control and abuse Tonya.
Where do you think you're going?
I have to go to the bathroom.
Don't tell me what you have to do. I paid for you to skate. You're gonna stay on the ice and skate. Get over here. You gotta get off the ice sometime, you hear me? Skate wet.
Making her choose between skating and the bathroom reinforces both characters' psychology. Her mother rationalizes this cruel behavior by saying that she was simply pushing her to spend more time on ice and become a champion. A rationalization which a young and impressionable Tonya, with no one else to turn to for support, accepts. This consistent treatment of Tonya had the effect of lowering her self-esteem. This lower self-esteem would be eventually what leads her into a relationship with Jeff, the second abusive relationship in her life. The treatment from her mother actually made the abuse from Jeff possible, and what compounds the problem is that when Tonya finally decides to break free of Jeff and do something about it, her mother's response is,
I'm supportive of this relationship, you hear me?
to approve of the relationship, even though she knows that he beats her daughter, further cementing the idea for Tonya that she is the one with the problem. This is even extended to figures of authority too. Later in the movie, Jeff, for lack of a more accurate term, kidnaps Tonya after assaulting her. When stopped by the police, the officer sees Tonya with a bleeding face and does nothing. Every single time, Tonya makes an attempt at breaking free and questioning whether she deserves better. All figures of authority and trust reinforce the idea that she is supposed to receive this kind of treatment.
I would say it would never happen again, but I figured
My mom hates me. She loves me.
So you see, if it weren't for her mother confusing her as a child and lowering her self-esteem, there's a good chance she would never have dated Jeff. Or at the very least, she would have left him once the abuse began, which would mean Jeff would not be with her during the Olympics and coerce her into hiring two idiots to assault Nancy and end Tonya's career as a skater, the one thing in her life that she enjoyed. As a thought experiment, I asked myself how differently the events may have unfolded if her father had been the one to stay and her mother left. She might not have been pushed to skate quite as much, but there's no arguments that she would be in a better physical and psychological condition. I, Tonya is a great film, and I recommend it to everyone. Its exploration of abusive psychology is not immediately obvious, but now that I pointed it out, I'm pretty sure you'll see it. Not just in this movie, but all around you as well. A while ago, I did an episode examining the psychology of abusive relationships, using the film I, Tonya as my reference point. The response I got was really great, and a lot of you sent messages to me about that episode. I'm not the type of person to only focus on negatives, so I decided to examine the other end of the spectrum and look at the qualities of love in relationships. And I picked a film which I think does this perfectly. If you gave me 1,000,000 years to ponder, I would never have guessed that true romance and Quentin Tarantino would ever go together. If you were to Google how to have a successful relationship, no matter what link you clicked on, you'd likely get the same answers time and again. Although Tarantino is an unlikely source, I think True Romance is a movie which perfectly understands all the key elements of a successful, loving relationship. True Romance tells the story of a lonely comic book store clerk named Clarence, who happens upon a girl who seems to enjoy all the same things that he does. She's playful, fun, easygoing, and instantly makes him feel relaxed. After sleeping with him, she reveals that she's actually a hooker paid for by his boss to get him laid on his birthday. Unfazed by the information, Clarence sets out on a quest to free her from the pimp controlling her, which leads to a pretty crazy adventure filled with drugs, gangsters, shootouts, and general danger. So far, you're probably not seeing how this film exemplifies romance, but that's only because I haven't told you yet. It's established in this opening scene where Clarence tells a random girl how much he'd like to fuck Alice, that he's friendly, polite, lonely, and honest. Why else would you make such an unusual confession? He's introduced as a character who is open to the possibility of finding a partner, and even actively pursues it. He just lacks the social skills to actually attain it. In this scene, he's rejected because of that honesty. Also, he does try to take her on a date where all they're going to do is watch kung fu movies. And who would agree to that? Later, when he actually goes to the movies, he meets Alabama, who is also there to see 3 kung fu movies in a row. She spills her popcorn on him and then sits next to him, using the excuse that she needs catching up on what she's already missed. They have a great time and then go to get some pie and talk afterwards, and as it turns out, they share a lot of common interests, and as shallow as those interests may be, they give both people an opportunity to connect. Now, it's true that later, when she reveals that she was paid to be there and entertain him on a date, it devalues the conversation a little bit. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter, because those things didn't really matter. The part that really mattered was genuine, the connection. A cynical person would say that she was only there because she was paid, and that it wasn't really a shared interest at all. But an observant person would see that actually, she really did dig kung fu movies, and her enjoyment of the date was entirely genuine. Not only does this movie understand the need for shared interests as a method of bridging awkwardness, it understands the use of shared interests. Other movies get both of these things all wrong, often showing 2 characters as polar opposites that attract. They then portray these interests that make them polar opposites as really important character-defining things. They're not. At least not in real life anyway. In real life, shared interests function as a simple means to connect with someone. The things themselves are not a deal breaker. Whether you can connect while talking about them is. Originally, I wrote these as 2 separate sections, but truthfully speaking, they're intrinsic to each other. The number 1 trait quoted as important in relationships is trust and/or honesty. They're so intrinsic because the minute you give one, the other comes automatically. If you trust someone, they become honest with you, and if you're honest with them, they come to trust you. Tarantino nails this. When Alabama reveals that she was paid to go on the date, rather than instantly rejecting her and becoming angry, which is pretty much what every other movie does, he accepts her because of her honesty, a neat reversal of what happened to him at the start. She comes clean after realising what a great guy he is, and swears to never be dishonest with him again. She never is. This pattern of trust and honesty continues throughout the entire movie, regardless of what the topic or question is. When Clarence asks about Alabama's pimp, she tells him what he wants to know. When he returns from killing Drexel, she asks what happened. At this point, he has 2 choices. He can lie and say he got into a fight and Drexel agreed to release her, or he could tell the truth and say he killed Drexel. The majority of people would very likely be tempted to lie, for a number of reasons, but chief among them is that killing someone is generally considered to be a bad thing, and most people would then judge you pretty negatively after you reveal it. Clarence picks option B and tells the truth. This is important for two reasons. One, it shows that he trusts her not to judge him or reject him. And two, it gives her the opportunity to appreciate and value such a damaging level of honesty. Rather than reject him or scorn him, she accepts his honesty and appreciates that what he did, no matter how terrible, was done only to protect her. In essence, these two characters, thanks to their foundation of honesty and trust, are non-judgmental of each other's actions because they understand the context behind them. Without that complete honesty and trust, they wouldn't have that context and would maybe slip into being judgmental. This film goes to great lengths to demonstrate how vital honesty and trust are in loving relationships, and gives multiple examples of honesty and trust being positively reinforced. It's not just training the characters to think this way. Vicariously, it's training you as well. Though it doesn't make many relationship prerequisite lists, teamwork is pretty vital in a relationship. Being on the same page means you both support each other. It also ties in with trust and honesty, since without those, you can't have this. The most significant example of this in the movie is during the scene in which Alabama has been discovered by one of the mobsters and is questioned. It's pretty clear from the very beginning of this exchange that he's got violent intent should things not go the way he wants. She begins by attempting to spin a lie to protect Clarence and herself. When it becomes obvious that he's not buying the lie, Alabama has two choices. She can give up Clarence and potentially save herself, or she can remain a team with Clarence and give the mobster nothing. For many people, giving up their partner to spare themselves a vicious beating and probably death from a person who has little to no morals when it comes to violence would seem like the most sensible choice. At the very least, it's the easiest choice. Alabama chooses option B and stays loyal to Clarence even though she knows it will mean being tortured by the mob enforcer. It's an extreme example, but sticking by your partner is another key ingredient to a successful relationship, even when those partners' choices may have put you in a difficult position. I feel as though it's important at this stage to point out that I'm not advocating sticking by your partner no matter what terrible thing they might have done. I'm advocating that if you trust them to have made decisions in your best interest, even though they might not have turned out as planned, then you should stick by that person, just like Alabama does with Clarence. Sometimes, being a team is as simple as small words of encouragement. For me, this is perhaps the most overlooked aspect of any relationship, and certainly one that many movies miss or don't fully understand. The idea that you should be ready and willing to sacrifice what you want for what your partner wants, sometimes. A good relationship understands that both partners will be willing to sacrifice for the greater good of the other. This is the message I think is demonstrated most obviously throughout this film. True romance is a bit more on the nose with its use of sacrifice, as both Clarence and Alabama are willing to sacrifice their lives to save the others. Clarence is willing to sacrifice his life for the chance at freeing Alabama from Drexel, and later, she's willing to sacrifice her life for the chance at saving Clarence's. It's even demonstrated when Clarence's dad is willing to sacrifice his life for his son's. But there are other smaller examples as well. Because sacrifice isn't just about the big sacrifices, sometimes it's about smaller things too. Clarence was willing to sacrifice his reputation to be honest with Alabama. She was willing to sacrifice her time to spend it with Clarence. Yeah, I know she was paid, but if we're totally honest, any other street-level call girl would probably have found the quickest possible way to sleep with him and get paid. She didn't. She was also then willing to sacrifice the relationship she had just built with Clarence in order to be honest with him. The film throws up plenty of examples of times when one of them is willing to sacrifice what they have for the greater good of the other person. And it's this element of sacrifice, the complete willingness to put someone else's happiness before your own, that gives this movie that feeling of true romance. This video was requested by Laurie J. Hope you enjoy it, my friend. An aspect of human existence which is both unavoidable and universally relatable is loneliness. At some point, every single person on the planet experiences this feeling. For some, it's short-lived, and for others it lasts a long time, but we all feel it. Her is a movie which I think explores the answers to the question, what does it mean to feel lonely? And what is connection? Theodore Twombly is a man who, after a recent separation from his wife, struggles to deal with the lack of connection in a modern and digital world. He feels distant and alone, despite, like ourselves, living in a world where every person he knows is at his fingertips. Theodore is a character who is not inherently depressed. At times, he feels more like a character indifferent to the world in which he lives. Yet we can see from what he does for a living that his true desire is to feel an emotional connection to the people around him. Theodore writes letters for other people. At first, it seems like a very charming job, in which he gets to vicariously live as another person. He writes very detailed and personal letters from one person to another, but never as himself. The amount of thought and care which goes into his letters reveals a great deal about the type of man he is. He's a romantic. The letters are more than just a description of events or thoughts. They often read like memories, helping to shape a relationship between two people that he has never even met. Once you realize that Theodore is creating an emotional connection between two strangers without creating any link for himself, it's actually quite melancholy. He's agonizingly close to what he wants. He even helps to shape and nurture it, but he himself never possesses it until he starts a relationship with a complex artificial intelligence named Samantha. During the first half of the movie, before he meets Samantha, loneliness is a key theme which is demonstrated and explored. The camera work often shows Theodore alone, in single shots or in wide shots, to highlight just how distant he feels from this vibrant and bustling city. The colours are a bit more muted and Theodore blends in with the background, giving a visual representation of how he perceives himself in the world. Unimportant. I find it interesting that as his connection to his world gets weaker, our visual connection to him gets weaker too. It shows just how badly he struggles to connect with a world that doesn't seem to share his somewhat old-fashioned viewpoint. Later, when Samantha suggests using a relationship surrogacy service, it makes Theodore uncomfortable. The manufactured physical intimacy is a reflection of the manufactured emotional intimacy which he creates for the customers he works for. Just like with the letters, he's close to what he wants, but ultimately, it's just a simulation and only further amplifies the loneliness, reminding him just how distant this world is to him. When we think of our connection to other people, we tend to categorize the importance of those relationships based on physical proximity. People we see a lot tend to be more valued by us than those whom we don't see much. Although there are other factors that help to shape those connections, being close to people really is about being close to people, at least partially. As the movie progresses, Theodore learns that physical proximity can be substituted for emotional proximity. The connection between Theodore and Samantha is defined by how much they're willing to share, how much they're able to be honest. What's interesting about the relationship between them is that it's essentially a blank slate for both parties to project their ideal onto the other. Due to the fact that Samantha was literally born yesterday, this makes it easy for Theodore to open up and share things because there's no chance of Samantha judging him. The connection between them works because Samantha sees Theodore as a person who can teach her about emotion, empathy, and as an insight into the human soul. For Theodore, he sees Samantha as a partner who fits his unrealistic view of relationships. She has all the qualities he's looking for, but with none of the drawbacks. She requires no maintenance in the beginning because everything is new for her, making the effort on his part minimal, because she's impressed by everything by default. He seems to enjoy nurturing her into a position of confidence and helping her to find her identity. The tragic part is that when she is in this position, she begins to branch out and make new friends, and Theodore begins to feel threatened as the relationship starts to echo the one he had with his ex-wife. This causes him to shut down and become defensive, severing the connection and restoring his loneliness. This experience reflects how we idealize relationships in the beginning and project our thoughts and feelings and expectations onto our opposite, and ignoring the complicated reality in favor of maintaining a romantic fantasy. I think the message that her is trying to send is that we shouldn't romanticize people, and we should value them for who they are, and not who we would like them to be. What is 500 Days of Summer about? On the surface, it looks like a romantic comedy centering around the idea of unrequited love and breakups. But it's not. It's really about how we delude ourselves in relationships and place unrealistic expectations and ideals on the significant other. 500 Days of Summer tells the story of how Tom meets the girl of his dreams, Summer, and spends his time trying to win her affections with his overtly romantic ideals. Told in parallel is the story of the eventual decline and breakup of that same relationship. While watching the movie, I identified with Tom and his pain because I was going through the same thing. I understood that level of rejection when you give yourself so completely to someone and they don't value what you've given them. What I realized was that Tom had made Summer completely responsible for his level of happiness. And that's a big weight to carry. The film is a great examination of how we blind or delude ourselves in relationships. One of the first things the film shows us is how Tom is enamored with even the smallest detail and idiosyncrasies of Summer.
I love her smile, I love her hair, I love her knees. I love this heart-shaped birthmark she has on her neck. I love the way she sometimes licks her lip before she talks. I love the sound of her laugh. I love
At the beginning of the relationship, when things are fresh and exciting, our brains are flooded with hormones which warp our opinion of the things that we see, hear, and feel. So things which in the long run are annoying habits or features, in the beginning feel like just the thing we've been looking for. The film presents the idea that Summer was always a flawed person, who never actually changed at all. What changed was Tom's perception of Summer. In the beginning, he had an unrealistically romanticized view of her, which created an unrealistic and impossible image for her to live up to. Later, we're shown the same scene, but with a different narration, a far more bitter narration.
I hate Summer. I hate her crooked teeth. I hate her 1960s haircut. I hate her knobby knees. And I hate her cockroach-shaped splotch on her neck. I hate the way she smacks her lips before she talks. I hate the way she sounds when she laughs.
What Tom doesn't realize is that he isn't bitter because Summer changed. He's bitter because Summer isn't who he expected her to be. In the scenes detailing the decline, Tom's perspective often shows Summer becoming colder and more distant. While he attempts to get closer, she pulls back. We're shown examples of how things they used to have fun doing become things in which she is disinterested. In Tom's eyes, she was simply not participating like she used to. But there are many occasions when we can see that she was actually pretty clear about what she wanted.
Tell you that I'm not really looking for anything serious.
But Tom chose to see that detail as playing hard to get, or just having her defences up, and just assumed that his romantic and thoughtful attitude would automatically win her over without actually considering her feelings. The idea that the problem is Tom is echoed by his friends and his sister, who allude to the fact that this has happened before, but even after they try to correct his perception into a more balanced and realistic one, he's completely resistant to it. Tom unknowingly sabotaged his own relationship with Summer. He ignored the actual characteristics of Summer in favour of supporting and maintaining his own unrealistic dream girl. When Summer behaved in a way which was natural for her, but contradictory to Tom's fantasy, he became frustrated and acted in a variety of negative and damaging ways. Tom's belief that Summer became disinterested for no reason is another fantasy, one created to protect his fragile ego. It was easier for him to believe that Summer lost interest and slowly drifted away than to accept that it was his unrealistic expectation which caused her to take a step back. The reality, of course, is that Summer had always maintained she didn't want a serious relationship, and each time Tom had moved further into serious territory, she moved further away. Instead of seeing her as a fun-loving person who enjoyed life and had a playful attitude, he chose to believe that he was responsible for that playful, fun-loving character, that it was their unique connection which brought that out in her. From the start, Tom wanted and expected Summer to be a particular person and behave in a particular way. The film successfully shows that it was that expectation which drove them apart. Tom even acknowledges that his expectation was unrealistic.
It's these cards, and the movies and the pop songs, they're to blame for all the lies and the heartache, everything. And we're responsible. I'm responsible.
But again, he doesn't accept that he could have changed that by simply appreciating reality instead of living a fantasy. Had Tom simply accepted what he was presented and allowed Summer to be herself without the weight of expectation, there's a good chance that they might have worked out, because the pressure that comes with expectation wouldn't have driven a wedge between them. And if it did, Tom would have recognised why that was happening and been able to manage it better. In one of the movie's later sequences, we're actually shown a side-by-side comparison of exactly how Tom's unfair expectations are causing him problems. Before he has ever reached the party, he has already decided that he was going to win Summer back without even considering her perspective at all. When the reality doesn't match that expectation, it sends him spiralling. Though it's not explicitly said, I think even their final encounter is in fact part of Tom's romanticized way of finally coming to terms with the end of the relationship, as it's Summer explaining things to him in the same emotionally open way that he has fantasized about for much of the movie. In some ways, it's progress, because he's finally considering her perspective, even if it might not be real at all. And this conversation and acceptance is a part of breakups that many of us lack, myself included. The lesson hidden inside 500 Days of Summer is to enter relationships with an open mind and not expect people to live up to an untenable fantasy. I think to some level, we're all guilty of ignoring reality in favour of trying to obtain and maintain a romanticised relationship which simply isn't possible. This movie in particular resonated with me so much while watching it, because it helped me to realise that maybe I'd done the same thing as Tom. Sometimes, maybe I'd ignored reality in favour of the fantasy. It's also a useful tool to help make those bad breakups easier, because when you see a real person instead of a fantasy, it's much easier to let them go.